Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Blaney, and I'm the head of unit in the European Chemicals Agency for prioritisation. And I was one of the colleagues involved in development of the tattoo inks restriction proposal, along with member state colleagues from Norway, Germany, Denmark, and Italy. We're organising this session today together with the European Commission to answer technical questions about the restriction that entered into effect in January this year. This is the first time we've organised a session like this for a restriction that had already entered into force, so please let us know in the feedback if you find it useful. The aim of the session is to respond to the substantial public interest relating to implementing the restriction. Whilst in the presentation we'll touch upon the reasons for introducing the restriction, as the restriction is now enforced, the focus will instead be on looking ahead how the restriction can be implemented and how we can help. So today we will give an overview of what the restriction is all about. We will give you the opportunity to ask questions, and then we will also share some useful resources with you to help with implementing the restriction. We'll begin with presentations from the European Commission on the background of the restriction, followed by presentations from us on the most common topics we have received. As you can see from the slide in front of you, my colleague Anna Maria Blasarico from the European Commission will present on the EU regulation on substances in permanent makeup, so the background. Then my colleague Karen Killen, also from the European Commission, will give you the information on the scope of the restriction. And then Christian Krasning, Evgenia Stoyanova, Faisal Mushtaq, and Eric van der Plas will give you further information on different elements in the restriction. So what is a reach restriction? Some information on specific pigments which are of most interest, I think, at the moment, on analytical methods, on how communication in the supply chain will work, and the requirements for preservatives in tattoo inks. And then, most importantly, we will have the question and answer session starting after these presentations. You can send your questions already now and throughout the webinar by going to slido.com and adding the event code #tattooinks22. Or you can directly scan the QR code you can see on the screen with your mobile device camera. We would ask you to keep your questions within the scope of this event, so questions to assist on the implementation of the restriction. And we may answer some questions through the Q&A Slido chat, or we may, for the majority of them, answer them through the live panel taking place from 3:30 to 4:30 Helsinki time. So if your question's not answered in the chat, please wait for the live panel. Our panel will include the presenters and other experts who worked on the restriction, and we brought them all together to be able to answer as many questions as possible that you might have. We will try to answer all the questions we received today. However, we may need to, we may get more questions than we have time for. And if we don't answer it by the end of the session, then we will try to answer them in a Q&A document we will publish after the webinar on the web address you can see on the screen. If you have any questions about the restriction after the webinar, then you can use our contact form, which you can find on our website. We will be recording this this session, and the recording will be available as fast as possible after the webinar closes, and you can find the link to that on our homepage and on our webinar page. The presentations are already published on the webinar page, and as I mentioned before, the Q&A will be published as soon as possible as we can after the event. And now I hand over to Anna Maria from the Commission, from DG Grow, who will present what the restriction is all about.
Hello, my name is Anna Maria Blasrico. I work in the European Commission and DG Grow. I have been involved in the preparatory phase to the final adoption of this restriction on hazardous substances in tattooings and permanent makeup. I am the one to start with some presentations that will follow, aiming to highlight the main topics of the regulation, starting with the background and the legislative process. Tattoo fashion is a worldwide phenomenon. 68% of people with tattoos have reported skin problems. 6% have reported persistent skin symptoms. Chronic allergic reactions and other inflammatory skin problems such as swelling, erythema, or disfiguring scarring are also reported. It is scientifically proven that only a few % of the injected tattoo ink is retained in the skin, while the rest can migrate to lymph nodes, liver, and be systemically available in the human body. Hazardous substances with intrinsic properties capable of causing cancer have been found in tattoo inks in the market. Cancer risks depends on multiple factors, usually requiring many years to become clinically observable, so causal links with specific chemicals in tattoo inks are difficult to establish. Nevertheless, the Risk Assessment Committee considered that the risk of carcinogenic, reprotoxic, and other systemic effects cannot be excluded if these hazardous substances are injected in the human body. The Council of Europe issued some recommendations on chemicals that tattoo inks should not contain in 2003 and 2008. These were the basis for the national legislation that some member states had. But only some member states had national legislation, and the member states asked the Commission to prepare legislation to harmonize rules across the EU. The aim of this restriction is to ensure a high-level protection of people's health against hazardous chemicals. EU citizens will be equally protected despite the country where they get the tattoo and whether the ink is manufactured in the EU or not. Very important as well is to ensure free movement of goods, as same requirements will apply in all member states. Most of the inks are commercialized via internet sales. The restriction introduced labeling obligations. This will help in case of adverse health effects, but also there are obligations to inform consumers about the ingredients. Better informed consumers will not be willing to take risks having black market inks. Therefore, this restriction is also a business opportunity for the good actors of the market. We are aware that this is an international benchmark, as it was already the case for the recommendations in the Council of Europe. To achieve these objectives, the purpose of this webinar is to help with the questions on the implementation and to establish a process to allow for providing assistance when new questions might arise in the future. Some words about the preparation of this restriction back in 2014 with the establishment of the Consumer Safety Network subgroup of tattoos and permanent makeup. This was followed up by a project launched by the Commission with the aim to provide regulators with scientific and technical basis to decide the best measure to ensure the safety of tattooings and permanent makeup. There were different options in the table, but finally it was decided to prepare legislation under the framework of the chemical legislation, in particular through REACH. So the Commission asked the European Chemical Agency to prepare what is called a restriction dossier. You will hear more about the details of a preparation of a restriction in the presentation of my colleague Christian later on, but I will give you some dates about the preparation of this particular restriction. In October 2017, ECHA submitted a restriction dossier that was prepared in cooperation with Italy, Denmark, and Norway, and with the contribution of Germany. There was a consultation on the restriction proposal from December 2017 to June 2018, and then consultations on the draft opinion by the committees from December to February 2019. Finally, in June 2019, ECHA submitted opinions of the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee to the Commission. The Commission prepared a draft proposal that was discussed with the Member States in the Risk Committee. It was voted, and then it was subject to the scrutiny by the European Parliament and the European Council. There is also an international consultation in accordance with the rules of the World Trade Organization to avoid technical barriers to trade. The regulation was published in December 2020, and there was 1 year transitional period fixed to allow stakeholders sufficient time to take appropriate measures to comply with the proposed restriction. The restriction entered into application on 5th of January 2022, except for the ban of the two pigments, Pigment Green 7, Pigment Blue 15.3, on which there is still almost 1 year ahead before the restriction entered into application. And now my colleague Karen Killian will explain the scope and other requirements of this restriction. Thank you very much.
Hello, I am Karen Killian, working at the Directorate General for the Environment of the European Commission, and I will tell you about the scope of the restriction on hazardous substances in tattoo inks. This restriction concerns mixtures that are used for tattooing purposes. Tattooing purposes in this context is defined as injecting or introducing a mixture in a person's skin, mucous membrane, or eyeball with the aim of making a mark or design on the body. This includes procedures like permanent makeup, cosmetic tattooing, microblading, and micropigmentation. The restriction covers three broad groups of substances. Firstly, substances that have an EU-wide harmonized classification in the so-called CLP regulation for being carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction, for causing skin allergy, for being corrosive or irritating to skin, or for causing serious eye damage or irritation to eyes. Secondly, it covers substances that are prohibited for all or for certain applications in the EU regulation on cosmetic products. And thirdly, it addresses a diverse group that contains certain impurities like heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, methanol, as well as certain azo dyes, which themselves are not classified as carcinogenic or mutagenic, but that do contain or can decompose to classified aromatic amines. With the restriction, it is not allowed to place on the market tattoo inks that exceed the maximum concentration set for substances in Entry 75 of Annex XVII and of Appendix 13 of REACH. Also, inks that do not meet the requirements of the restriction cannot be used for tattooing. Some substances may fall under several of the concentration limits that have been set in the restriction, and in such cases, the lowest relevant limit applies for them. The restriction also contains so-called dynamic links with the Cosmetics Products Regulation and with the CLP Regulation, meaning that the restriction will also apply after a transitional period to substances that will be added in the future to relevant parts of those regulations. The transitional period is 18 months after the entry into force of an amendment to the respective regulation, which for CLP also coincides with the date of application of a new classification. Here is an overview of the concentration limits that are set by the restriction for different groups of substances. I will not read them out one by one, but you can see that the limit is lowest for substances that are carcinogenic or mutagenic, and such that are prohibited or have certain restrictions in the Cosmetic Products Regulation. Higher limits apply to reproductive toxicants and skin sensitizers, and again higher limits for substances that have irritative or corrosive effects on skin and eye. For the diverse group of substances listed individually in Appendix 13, specific limits have been set in that annex. The restriction also contains a number of requirements for the labeling of tattoo inks, which are intended to improve the information to users and customers. Firstly, inks must carry a statement that the content is a mixture for use in tattoo or permanent makeup. Inks also need to have a reference number that allows to identify the batch, and similar to cosmetic products, the ingredients need to be listed in decreasing order of concentration. There are also specific labeling requirements for substances that are used as pH regulators and for the allergenic properties of nickel and chromium-6. This information must be clearly visible on the package, it must be easily readable and indelible. However, if the package itself is too small to carry this information, it must be included in the instructions for use that accompany the product. And lastly, the restriction also includes an obligation for the tattooist to inform customers about the information that is provided on the package or the instructions of use. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I now hand over to my colleague Christian Krasnick, who will tell you more about REACH restrictions in general.
Hello, my name is Christian Krasnick. I'm working in the European Commission in a REACH unit, and I'm dealing with the restriction on tattoo inks since it has been adopted. And you have already heard two presentations from my colleagues. I will tell you a little bit about what is actually a REACH restriction and how it can be changed if there is any issue that should be changed in such a restriction. Just to recall what my colleagues might have told you already, the REACH objectives are to ensure a high level of protection of human health and environment when it comes to chemical safety. And also at the same time, obviously, with those chemicals in the internal market, we want to ensure that those chemicals can freely circulate. And if those chemicals are in some mixtures or in some articles and products, that they can also freely circulate in the market. And that applies obviously also to tattoo inks. So we have this restriction under REACH on tattoo inks. And I would like to tell you what is actually the purpose of such a restriction and when do we apply such restrictions. A restriction is one of the possible measures under REACH to manage the risk of a substance. And we apply such a restriction if such a risk from a chemical substance is not adequately controlled. A restriction might then tackle or concern the manufacturing of the substance or the placing on the market. That includes also imports of those substances and the articles if they are contained, if those substances are contained in the articles. And they might also concern the use of a substance. And then we can obviously apply that restriction to the substance on its own, or to the substance in a mixture, or to the substance in an article. There are all possibilities there. It's a very flexible instrument, such a restriction, and we can obviously have a tailor-made solution for each possible risk from such a chemical substance. How can this then look like? We can have, in the end, in such a restriction, we can have a ban on a chemical substance, like we have here in the case of tattoo inks. We have banned certain substances from those tattoo inks. We can have limitations in the use, which we have also applied in that tattoo ink restriction. And we can also have limits on the concentration. And that is also featuring in that tattoo ink restriction. So we have used some different elements here. And in addition, we can also have other relevant conditions that we put in such a restriction, some specific technical measures, for instance, in a lab or in an industrial site, or we can require specific labels. And in the case of the tattoo ink restrictions, my colleagues told you already about it. For instance, on the label of such a tattoo ink, we want the manufacturers of those tattoo inks, we want them to list all the ingredients. That is obviously also useful information when it comes to the use of such a tattoo ink, or when it comes to the consumer who wants to know what is actually contained in such a tattoo ink. All these restrictions, and including the tattoo ink restrictions, they are listed in the so-called Annex XVII to REACH. So this in Annex XVII, you have a table with different entries with the different substances that are restricted, and also listing the conditions that are then imposed on those different substances. So we have talked about what the restriction is all about. Now about the process, how is that initiated? I think the basics you have already also heard from my colleagues, but just to get a bit more into the detail of the legislative procedure, so to say. In principle, the restriction process is either initiated by the Commission or a member state. If the Commission initiates it, then ECHA, the chemical agency in Helsinki, they are preparing a so-called Annex XV dossier. If a member state initiates it, then the member state prepares that dossier himself. And in this Annex XV dossier, we are collecting information on the hazards and the risks of the substances, about alternatives to those substances. And there's also a socio-economic assessment contained in that collection of information about pros and cons, impacts of banning, for instance, such a substance, and so forth. So that is the basic information that is needed. And that is then also assessed in the next stage, which is the opinion making of the ECHA committees. There are two committees. There is one committee for risk assessment, and that committee has 9 months to deliver an opinion on such an Annex XV dossier. And there's the committee on socioeconomic analysis, and that one has 12 months. And in addition to all that information collected and assessed, everybody who has an interest in this restriction, industry, NGOs, anybody out there, can have a say also through the so-called consultations. So there are consultations ongoing where those people out there, industry, companies, and so forth, can also make their input. And if in the end, then the Commission concludes that there is a risk that is unacceptable from a specific substance, then the Commission is making a so-called legislative proposal for amending this Annex XVII. And the Annex XVII, I've already told you, is the place where all these restrictions are actually listed. So making a calculation now how long this process takes. So I told you about the collection stage where a lot of information is collected. So this takes at least a few months, if not years, sometimes even longer than a year, 2 years even sometimes. Then we have the stage of the opinion making where the two committees have either 9 months or 12 months to deliver the opinion. And then we have the consultations that are going in parallel. And the Commission has 3 months to prepare then the proposal. So altogether, it's a rather long process. It's a rather complex process. So not shorter than 1 year, 2 years to end up with such a proposal for a restriction. Having said that about the general process, so if then there is a need to change such a restriction when we want to amend it, when we want to add, for instance, a substance in the list of restricted substances, or when we want to change a concentration limit, or when we want to add an exemption because we found out that after all a substance is safe and not unsafe and not risky. In principle, changing such a restriction takes as long as the establishment of the original restriction. There is no shortcut, so to say. So again, changes, then we need to collect information. We need to assess the information. The committees need to do that. There need to be consultations. And in the end, then the Commission also needs to conclude whether such a change is warranted or not. So unfortunately, there is no shortcut. And again, we would not see any possible, would say, very short process to make such changes. Having said that, in this specific restriction now on tattoo inks, for the addition of new substances that should also be restricted, and at the same time, theoretically, also if you want to remove some of the substances, we have put in place a so-called dynamic link between that restriction and other pieces of legislation. The colleagues already told you about that. On one hand, that's the link to the CLP regulations, which is classification, labeling, and packaging, where you have a list of substances like carcinogenics, mutagenic substances, and so forth. And on the other hand, the link to the cosmetic product regulation. And for those substances covered in those two pieces of legislation, if there is something added there or something removed there, it's also automatically added or removed in the REACH restriction on tattooing. So that is a bit of a shortcut, but nevertheless, obviously changing the CLP regulation and changing the cosmetic product regulation would also take some time. And this is, so after all, also not a possibility really to accelerate the process for changes. But as I said, since it's a very complex procedure, we can have this dynamic link to have a quicker reaction when it comes to the addition of new substances and the removal of other substances. Now, what just to give you a bit more of substance, what such a dossier to prepare a restriction needs to contain. We have obviously on the ECHA website different sources of information. As said, information is often requested from the public, including industry, to assist with the assessment. So there are the consultations going on. There is also participation in the meetings of the scientific committees. And the two links here given on the slide, one on the consultation guidance is particularly useful information and necessary information because it explains actually what is needed during the assessment of the restriction by RAC and CEAC, but also during the general information collection stage. And then when it comes to the detailed information on the hazard and exposure information, there's also a guidance document on the ECHA website about information requirements and chemical safety assessment. I hope this gave you some further insight how such a restriction works and how it can be changed if needed. I thank you very much, and we are happy to answer any questions in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and good afternoon to our webinar participants. My name is Evgenia Stoyanova, and I coordinated the work on the restriction proposal developed by ECHA together with experts from Norway, Denmark, Italy, and Germany. The first topic I'm going to speak to you about is the upcoming restriction on Pigment Blue 15.3 and Pigment Green 7. As you know, this restriction comes into effect early next year. I will explain why there is a restriction and provide you with resources that can help you with the identification of alternatives to the two pigments if you haven't transitioned already. Why are these two pigments restricted? They are regulated under the Cosmetics Products Regulation. As you know, all other substances on Annex II and Annex IV with conditions on their use in the Cosmetics Products Regulation are already restricted in tattooings because of human health risks due to dermal exposure. Because of information about the importance of these pigments to industry and the need for safer alternatives, RAC and CEAC assessed whether these two pigments can be derogated or excluded from the restriction. RAC, due to the limited information on hazards and risk, could not exclude these pigments for the remaining substances for which there is regulatory action due to human health concerns under the CPR. Primarily for this reason, RAC, as a result, did not support the derogation, but noted that some known alternatives could lead to equal or greater risk, noted that the industry comments on the essential role of the pigments and the lack of technically feasible alternatives. The Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis supported a time-limited derogation for these two pigments. In the Commission final decision, 1 additional year was given to these two pigments to transition to safer alternatives in comparison to the remaining substances in the scope of the restriction. In addition, RAC looked into a non-exhaustive list of other blue and green pigments for which there was information that they were used or could be used in tattooings. Their work is summarized in Appendix B12 in the background document. In summary, they concluded that some blue and green pigments are of high concern. Some pigments are expected to have low hazard profile, but have limited information on hazardous properties and technical feasibility, Pigment green 36, which had emerged as the main substitute for pigment green 7, cannot be considered a less hazardous alternative to pigment green 7. What is the current situation less than 1 year before it's applicable to these two pigments? Some companies have announced alternatives to pigment blue 15.3. ECHA does not track this information. There are resources, in addition to RAC's work that I just mentioned, that can help with the identification of safer alternatives to these two pigments, as well as to other substances in the remaining restricted categories. As if a substance is not currently restricted in tattoo inks, it may still present risk to human health when injected into the skin. ECHA's website contains information on thousands of chemicals, including their hazard and self-classification by registrants and CLP notifiers. ECHA's back tool provides information on the activities that are planned or ongoing by ECHA or by member states in several areas, including for harmonized classification and labeling. Furthermore, to help with risk assessment, ECHA has a guidance on information requirements and chemical safety assessment, which is applicable to all chemicals subject to REACH. The work for the restriction proposal presents a risk assessment approach for substances in tattoo inks. I've included links to these resources on the slide. Other potential resources, not developed by ECHA, but with tattoo safety in mind, include a recent publication by the BFR with a focus on tattoo pigments and a 2018 publication by the Council of Europe. In summary, the restriction will apply to pigment blue 15.3 and pigment green 7 from January next year. And in this presentation, we've provided some available resources to help identify safe, suitable long-term alternatives to these two pigments. The next topic I will speak to you about is analytical methods for tattoo inks. Some of the questions we received with respect to analytical methods relate to the availability of methods measuring the concentration limits in the restriction, differences in methods used by industry and enforcement authorities, and a diversity of methods used in different member states. I'll tell you where to find more information and about future actions on analytical methods. Member states have the responsibility for enforcing EU legislation. Analytical methods are key tools for enforcement. At the time of the RAC and SEC evaluation of the restriction proposal, a number of recommendations were made, mainly based on advice from the Enforcement Forum. It was noted that several member states already enforced similar legislation on tattoo inks using analytical methods for most substances in the scope, and highlighted the importance of standardization of analytical methods, recommended that a guideline is developed for enforcement authorities, identifying, among others, a priority list of substances for enforcement and indicating analytical methods. Methods applicable to other matrices could be considered and modified. It was recommended that information on best available practices is shared among relevant stakeholders, for example, through the Forum Compendium on Analytical Methods for Enforcement of Restrictions. At the time of the dossier development, the dossier submitters, ECHA, Norway, Denmark, and Italy, compiled information available on analytical methods, largely based on work by the Joint Research Center on the safety of tattoo inks and permanent makeup, which was based on a broad consultation. These methods can be found in Appendix D2 of the background document for the restriction. They include methods for the following groups of substances. Some are specifically for tattoo inks, but others are for other matrices and may require adaptation. Since then, several member states have been dedicating resources for the development of analytical methods for substances in tattoo inks. For example, we received information that recently the Italian Ministry of Health has finalized 2 projects and intends to allocate further resources in the near future. Substances in the scope of the first two projects include primary aromatic amines, phthalates, preservatives, metals, and pigments. A publication of the method developed with phthalates is available, Leoni et al., as you can see on the slide. A publication on the quantification of preservatives in tattoo inks is under review. A method developed for primary aromatic amines, already in use in 2 national enforcement laboratories, was adapted for the restriction scope. No publication is available yet. Work is still ongoing for the other substances. As I said, enforcement is a member state responsibility, and ECHA does not develop or validate analytical methods. But Forum, which is a network of enforcement authorities of REACH and other regulations, aims at contributing to harmonized enforcement. Among other tasks, the Forum is mandated to identify best practices in enforcement and develop tools for local inspectors. Forum is encouraging exchange of information on analytical methods among member states with the ultimate goal to expand the compendium of analytical methods for restrictions with recommended methods for substances in tattoo inks. This compendium is developed under the mandate of Forum to spread good practices, as very few restrictions have harmonized analytical methods, and there is a need to develop a common approach to enforcement of restrictions across the EU. Therefore, for each new restriction coming into force, Forum begins with collection of analytical methods used by member state enforcement authorities to ensure compliance with the restriction, with the aim to assess these methods and recommend a suitable method via their compendium. This is a long process, as member states have limited resources and several restrictions have come recently into force. Such collection of methods is a regular exercise. The data collection of analytical methods for tattoo inks is expected to be part of such next exercise. The information gathered will be assessed to recommend the methods that the Forum experts consider to best fit the purposes of compliance control, with the view to update the compendium. From the following webpage, you can access the compendium of analytical methods and Forum's methodology for recommended analytical methods for restrictions. Also, there is a link to an Excel spreadsheet that can be used by member states, but also by the public, to submit information on analytical methods, and we invite you to do so. Thank you. My colleague Faisal will now speak about communication in the supply chain.
Hello. My name is Faisal Mushtaq, and I work in the Exposure and Supply Chain Unit at the European Chemicals Agency. Today, I'm going to talk to you about communication in the supply chain, the roles of the various actors and some of their duties. What you see on the screen now is a very simplistic representation of a supply chain and the different actors in it, including some information flows both upstream and downstream. At the top of the supply chain is a registrant, a manufacturer or importer. They register substances, for example, pigments, to put them on the market. As part of that registration, they provide information on the hazards, and when the registration is above 10 tons per year, they also have to assess the uses. They then provide this information to the authorities and also in the supply chain to their customers. Their first customer would be a formulator. For example, tattoo ink manufacturers. They take the pigments and put them into mixtures which are tattoo inks. The tattoo ink manufacturers then supply the mixtures further to end users who could be, for example, professional tattoo artists. Both the formulators and the end users, the tattoo ink manufacturers and the tattooists, are called downstream users. We often use the term DU to describe them. As you can see here, that information flows upstream to the registrant on the uses and also on the hazards, if the downstream users have information on hazards, and information flows downstream via the safety data sheet. And when there has been an assessment of the uses, the safety data sheet has exposure scenarios attached describing how to use the substances safely for those particular uses. Now, if you are a downstream user, you have certain duties. And I will not talk about the legal aspects, but how to practically comply with those duties. A downstream user's duties are triggered when they receive a safety data sheet. And in particular, there are some specific duties associated with the attached exposure scenario, if there is one. Generally, you receive a safety data sheet and you have to apply the measures to use the substance safely. When you do have an exposure scenario, it means that the substance is hazardous and it has been registered above 10 tons a year. And now you have to check whether your use is covered in the exposure scenario, meaning that it has been already assessed. And a formulator can check both his own uses and the uses of his customers. He does this by comparing the information he receives via the safety data sheet with the conditions at his own site or his customer sites. And then if he is in line, then he does not need to do anything further in this regard. However, if his uses are not covered, then he has to do something. He might, for example, simply have to make sure that he is in line with the conditions, but he may have to take other actions, including contacting his supplier. And we will talk about this a bit more. So if a downstream user finds that his use is not covered by the exposure scenario he's received, then he has a number of options. Firstly, he can contact his supplier. He can provide information on his uses and the conditions of his use. Basically, he needs to provide enough information that gets to the registrant, that the registrant will then be able to assess for him and include it in the registration. He should then receive an exposure scenario with that use included. There may be situations where a supplier cannot do this. For example, a registrant may decide that the use is not safe and therefore he might call it a use advised against in the safety data sheet. There is another option, is to change the process to implement the conditions. If you can find a similar exposure scenario, you could also substitute with another substance or a process or stop the activity. I mean, if you are in a situation where the substance is restricted, then there's little that you might be able to do about it apart from substitute. One other alternative is to find another supplier who might cover the use. So even if your own supplier at the moment makes it a use against another supplier, might decide to cover that use. And then lastly, there's always an option for a downstream user to do their own assessment. Now, ideally, the assessment is done at the top of the supply chain with the registrant, as that is where the technical knowledge and expertise is, as they are chemical manufacturers. As you go further down the supply chain, a formulator has some level of technology, so could also do this kind of assessment, but an end user is normally not within the chemical industry themselves. For example, a professional tattoo artist would not normally have the know-how to do this, but they could then go to a consultant and use them. But if possible, the further up the supply chain, the better the assessment is done. There are a couple of situations where you don't have to do a downstream user chemical safety report. And these two situations are where your total usage is less than 1 ton per year. And this might be difficult for a formulator who supplies many end users. But an end user themselves might actually use less than 1 ton a year, so they could rely on this exemption. And the second situation is when a substance is used for what is called PPOD. This is product and process-oriented research and design. In simple terms, it's a new product being made, and in terms of research and design, it is not being put on the market yet, but researched. And they might need more than 1 ton per year, but it's still small amounts. So in this very specific situation, they do not need to do a chemical safety report. Now, one last thing is that even if you are doing a downstream user chemical safety report or you are relying on an exemption, a downstream user has to report to ECHA. This means that they have to notify ECHA about the use and the use conditions, and, for example, what exemption they're relying on. They do not submit the actual assessments to ECHA. For more information, you can look on the ECHA website. We have a dedicated web page, Communication in the Supply Chain. We have a number of web pages tagged with Downstream User. We have a guidance for downstream users, which describes what I've told you in much greater detail and goes into more ins and outs and complicated situations. We also have made a practical guide on how to prepare a downstream user chemical safety report. And we have a number of sections in the Q&As for the downstream users, for the downstream user chemical safety report, the downstream user notification, and for safety data sheets in general. And you should be able to find the answer to your questions there. Additionally, you could contact your national help desk, and you could ultimately contact the ECHA help desk if you have a very specific question that you want to have answered. Hopefully you found this information helpful, and if not, as I mentioned, you can always contact the help desk. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Faisal. I will now give the next presentation. My name is Erik van der Plassen. I'm the chair of the Biocidal Products Committee in ECHA, and I've worked in the biocide sector for almost 20 years. So I will tell you something about preservatives, the use of preservatives in relation to the REACH restriction on tattoo inks and permanent makeup. So the outline of my presentation is that I will first go into the details of what are the requirements for preservatives under the REACH restriction, but then the majority of my presentation will be related to what this means for the use of preservatives with respect to its obligation under the Biocidal Products Regulation. And during my presentation, I will give further information on how to meet your legal requirements when it comes to the REACH restriction, but especially when it comes to the Biocidal Products Regulation. So first about the REACH restriction. The REACH restriction on substances in tattoo inks does not limit the use of preservatives per se, but any substance with hazardous properties that can lead to certain human health risks. And some of these preservatives are then impacted because they have a harmonized classification, which leads then to restrictions under this REACH restriction. But preservatives are also subject to the Biocidal Products Regulation. So if I move then to the Biocidal Products Regulation, preservatives in tattoo inks belong to product type 6, preservatives for products during storage. And in fact, there are 3 stages in the process when it comes to the BPR, the Biocidal Products Regulation. First of all, there is the approval of the active substance in product type 6. And a recent example is BIT. Followed by this, there is the authorization of the biocidal product. If the substance is approved, the biocidal product will need to be authorized. So the preservative containing this biocidal product is authorized to preserve tattoo inks. And last, a tattoo ink treated with a preservative is considered a treated article under the BPR. And there are rules in the BPR on the placing on the market of treated articles, so in this case the tattoo ink. Biocidal products are in a transitional phase. And that's good to remember because that leads to 2 different situations. First of all, the active substance can be approved or under assessment. And if the active substance is approved, that means that the biocidal product containing this active substance will need to be authorized. So there's this requirement for authorization. And under the BPR, this can either be a national authorization granted by a member state, which can be followed by what is called a mutual recognition process in other member states where the company wants to place this biocidal product on the market. But it can also be union authorization granted by the Commission. And in that case, the biocidal product can be placed on the market in the whole EU. The other situation is that the active substance is still under assessment. And in this case, national rules applies for the member state. And it's good to mention that these rules vary among member states. It can go from a simple notification to a complete authorization process similar to the BPR, which is the situation in the Netherlands, for example. Moving then to tattoo inks and treated articles. Only tattoo inks preserved with preservatives which are either approved or under assessment can be placed on the EU market for product type 6. And a list is available on the ECHA webpage. And you find the link in this slide. The list is dynamic because if a substance is not approved, it will have to be removed from the list. So the latest version of the list is from November 23 of last year. The other thing to mention is that tattoo inks preserved with some preservatives need to be labeled according to Article 58.3 of the BPR. And an example of these are CMIT, MIT or MBIT. And that leads to certain obligations. And these are laid down in this Article 58.3. And one example is that the name of the active substance needs to be on the label of the tattoo ink. And you can find the other conditions, the other provisions in Article 58.3 of the BPR. We looked at all the active substances which are either approved or are still under assessment and the biocidal products related to that, because we think this information might be useful for you so that you know which preservative can be used to preserve tattoo inks. And again, there are two situations. And this slide presents the first situation where the active substance is approved under the BPR for product type 6. In total, there are now 11 active substances which are approved in product type 6 under the BPR. And all of these active substances have a harmonized classification. And 7 of these approvals contain conditions for treated articles. And after the webinar, we will make this information available to you. So which active substances and which ones have conditions for treated articles. But what is relevant for you, we think, to know is how many of the biocidal products which are authorized based on these active substances can be used in tattoo inks. So they are authorized to preserve during storage in product type 6. But we want to know then how many of these can be used to preserve tattoo inks. So we've asked the question to member states because we do not have this information ourselves within the agency. And in the near future, we will make this information available to you. But it's good to know that there are a limited amount of biocidal products which are authorized for product type 6 for these approved active substances. Next, we go to the other situation. So the active substances in product type 6, which are still under assessment. In this case, we talk about 37 active substances, which still have to be reviewed, and they can either lead to approval or non-approval. For us as an agency, it's unknown if under national rules, these active substances can be used to preserve tattoo inks. And again, we've contacted the member states whether they can provide us with information, whether under their national rules, these active substances can be used to preserve tattoo inks. And again, in the future, we will make this information available to you. So we are gathering more information to get an overview of preservatives which can be used in tattoo inks. And as said, we will make this information available. And by doing so, we will continue to support you to meet your obligations, not only under REACH, but under the REACH restriction, but also under the Biocidal Products Regulation. And in the link on this slide, you can find more information on the Biocidal Products Regulation on the ECHA website. Thank you.
So this ends the presentation part of the webinar. And now we move on to the question and answer session where our live panel will reply to your questions. But before we introduce the panel, here's just a quick recap of the question and answer session. We will run the question and answers until 16:30 Helsinki time. You can keep sending your questions to slido.com by adding the event code on the screen or directly with the QR code also on this slide. As mentioned before, we will do our best to answer everything we can, but depending on the number of questions, we may not be able to answer all of them. All questions, including the ones we cover in the live panel, will be replied to in our Q&A document that will be available shortly after the event. You'll find it on the webinar page, and we will announce it in our weekly news bulletin. You can subscribe to it at echa.europa.eu/subscribe. If you have questions after the webinar, you can reach us through our contact forms from the address that you can see on the slide. In Slido, you will also find a short event poll. I hope you'll take the time to share your feedback with us so that we continue to improve our future content. So now I hand over to my colleague Simone Doyle, who will be moderating the Q&A session, and we will start shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this questions and answers session of the webinar on the reach restriction of hazardous substances in tattoo inks and permanent makeup. We're really happy that you've joined us today. My name is Simone Doyle, and I'm the head of unit of one of the risk management units at the European Chemicals Agency, and I'll be your moderator today. Our panel is made up of today's presenters. We have Anna Blas Rico and Christian Krasnick from the European Commission, as well as Mark Blaney, Yevgenia Stoyanova, and Faisal Mustak from ECHA. We'll also bring in Eric van der Plasche, the chair of our Biocidal Products Committee, in the last 15 minutes of the Q&A to answer your questions on any biocidal product-related questions. So first of all, let me thank you all for sending all of your questions to us in advance. We got lots of them and we're looking forward to answering them today. Just to let you know how we're going to run today's session. So we're going to be replying to a mix of those questions that you sent to us, as well as the ones that you're sending to us currently via the Slido. Just to remind that please keep your questions within the scope of this event. So we're mainly covering questions relating to the technical implementation of the restriction today. And as my colleagues as you've already heard, that the questions received today and within the scope of this webinar will be answered in a Q&A document, and that document will be published after this event. Don't worry if you don't have your question answered in this event today, so you can check the published Q&A document once it's available. Okay, so then let's get started with the questions today. First one is for you, Anna, and it's what is the official application procedure to present any additional data to start a new evaluation of formaldehyde and other limits to amend the restriction? What's the procedure to extend the derogation for Pigment Blue 15.3 and Pigment Green 3? Anna, please unmute yourself.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for the question. For any amendment of a REACH restriction, of the Appendix 17 of the REACH restriction, there is a need to have a dossier, a toxicological dossier, to be assessed by ECHA's committee to decide whether there should be an amendment of the restriction or not. This dossier needs to be submitted by a member state or by ECHA. In the case of ECHA, it will be a request from the Commission, so the Commission can request ECHA to prepare such dossier for assessment by the ECHA's committee. So in a way, it's a similar process as the one to prepare a restriction. For the particular case of the formaldehyde and the two pigments that the questions refer to, it will be the same. With regards to formaldehyde, the questions we have received refers to the fact that formaldehyde is maybe released from the sterilization process. So when it comes to the presence of the substance formaldehyde in the ink, we need to remind that this is a carcinogenic substance, and it will be difficult to justify a decrease in the limit. So in terms of an amendment, it is maybe worth to assess what is the origin or the presence of the formaldehyde or where it comes from to avoid the substance that released formaldehyde in the first place, to assess if there is another possibility to sterilize the inks which will not release formaldehyde, and to try to identify another possibility for sterilization, or another possibility to use single-use inks, for example. This is to say that it will be difficult to justify a decrease of the limit of a substance which is carcinogenic. On the two pigments, again, as I said, you need to send a dossier, and I refer to some of the questions whether there will be time to amend this before the deadline. You need to understand that this process takes time, and it will be difficult to allow to have this assessment before the deadline. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, let's move to the next question. So it is, which name or identifier of an ingredient shall be labeled in the absence of a common ingredient name, if neither an Iupac name nor a CAS or an EC number are available? And Christian, maybe you could take this question.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, if in those exceptional cases where those identifiers listed in the restriction are not available, then any other common name, trade name, or whatever can be used to identify the substance. The purpose of the identifier is obviously to clearly and safely identify the substance in the mixture. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see that our next question is, the new restriction is causing a disruption on the market. Is ECHA planning to support the substitution of tattoo inks? And if yes, how? Anna, maybe you could take this one.
Yes, thank you. Now that the restriction has been approved and published, ECHA does not have a formal role in this particular assessment. So the Commission is aware that there is a big effort to implement this restriction because of the wider scope. So that's why we are organizing this webinar with the purpose to help with implementation of this restriction. So this is the main objective, and we will see if there is a need for more actions after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is more to do with communication in the supply chain. So what does ECHA recommend to make the communication in the supply chain better? Has ECHA received information from our suppliers after we informed them of our use of PG 15.3 and PG 7? And could ECHA moderate a dialogue between different market sectors or actors with the objective to stabilize the ink market? Faisal, over to you for this one.
Thank you for that, Simone. I think this is difficult because ECHA doesn't have a formal role in the supply chain. And so it's difficult for us to say to industry how they should communicate better with each other. We invite industry to communicate better with each other and get to know each other. We found that in other industries, REACH has actually improved this communication. For the second part of the question, we haven't received information related to these particular pigments in response to Article 37.3. There are some registrations with users advised against in them, but we don't know if they are in response to this because we don't know who is the downstream user that made this request, when this request was made, to which registrant the request was made, or any of these things. As I said, our role is quite limited. Therefore, although we can see that there are users advised against, we don't know for what reason they are there. And I think that after this webinar, the Commission and ECHA will decide together as a follow-up how to maybe help in this way. But thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you, Faisal, for the answer. Evgenia, maybe the next one's for you. Why doesn't the restriction offer the option to bypass or to waive certain general concentration limits? Why isn't the concentration limit of category 2 substances higher than the corresponding concentration limit of category 1 substances?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Simone. The answer to this question is in the RAC final opinion. RAC pointed out that substances such as CMR, skin sensitizer, irritant or corrosive substances, those prohibited in cosmetics under the CPR, should not be contained in tattoo inks, but for the purpose of ensuring the practicality and monitorability of the proposed restriction, a sufficiently low concentration limits were derived for these substances to discourage use. Therefore, RAC did not propose different concentration limits for hazard categories.
Thank you, Evgenia. And we'll keep going with some of the pre-received questions, maybe one or two more, and then we'll go over to the Slido and look at the questions that we've got already today. Who has the obligation to ensure that tattoo inks meet the requirement of Annex 17? Do I have to test for all substances? Evgenia, can you take that one as well?
Yes, thank you. We've coordinated this question with our help desk to ensure that we've given similar answers to all inquirers. Any company, including ink formulators, placing on the market a tattoo ink mixture needs to comply with the relevant obligations of this restriction. In order to comply with these requirements, a supplier must be aware of the identity of the constituents of their mixture and their concentration. Ink formulators should receive from their suppliers detailed information on the composition of the ingredients they use. In the absence of detailed information on the ingredients from the suppliers, it is up to the ink formulator to decide to request detailed information from their suppliers, refer to a different supplier, or test their mixture to ensure compliance. Thanks.
Thank you, Evgenia. And I see another interesting question here. Maybe Christian, you could take this one. It's medical tattooing pigments are out of the scope of the current restriction, but are still being used. and why is that?
Well, medical tattoos are specifically regulated in the medical device regulation, and there is a very fine process there on benefit risk assessment when it comes to the approval of such tattoo inks that are placed on the market for medical tattoos. So in the end, this is a process that is well established and also well refined. When it comes to tattoos or tattoo inks that have both purposes, meaning medical tattoos and non-medical purposes, then both regulations must apply together. So in the end, there is no reason why medical tattoos or tattoo inks for medical tattoos should not be regulated under the medical device regulation, since this is the regulation that was purposefully established to regulate such tattoo inks for medical purposes.
Thank you, Christian. Interesting. Anna, maybe you could take the next one. It's what content should the safety instructions for use mentioned in paragraph 7G of the restriction have?
Yes, thank you. Well, you know, the restriction prescribes some obligations for labeling, and this is compulsory, and then it refers to the safety instructions. That is, as the question raises, is not so clearly described what is meant there. So I can explain what is meant to be included there is something which is not compulsory, like instructions for use, like precautions that the tattoo artist should take in case of using the substance. So it can be anything which is not compulsory by CLP requirements or by the requirements in the restrictions in the points A to F of the labeling requirements. And the restriction also says that in case these requirements are too big to be included in the bottle, for example, all the requirements can be included in the safety instructions, except the labeling that the inks is for tattoo use. So in the safety instructions, you can also include the compulsory requirements that are not fit because of the size of the package. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And I actually noticed that there was another related question on that. So the restriction states that tattoo artists have to provide customers with the information marked on the packet or included in the instructions for use. How should this be done, verbally or in a written document? So Anna, sorry for that. Maybe you started to answer the question, but maybe Christian, you can come in on this one as well.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Simon. Well, the purpose of that provision is that tattoo artists have enough legal certainty, obviously, when it comes to the use of the tattoo inks, and the consumers, the people receiving the tattoos, should feel safe when they receive the tattoos. And when it comes to the exact implementation, there's certain flexibility in the restriction that we have adopted, and we think that over time there will be best practice models developed by both the enforcement authorities and the tattoo sector to how this should be best done, whether this information is provided orally, whether it's provided in written format, or whether there is maybe a mix of both, that you have certain information that is provided in written format when a person is tattooed, and in addition you also explain certain provisions to the consumers in your tattoo shop.
Thank you, Christian. So let's now, I hope that everyone is happy to hear the answers of the questions that you've submitted in advance. So thanks again for those, and thank you everyone for your answers. Now we'll take a little look at the Slido of the questions that are coming in during the event. And I see that people are liking certain ones, which them come to the top. So let's just start at the first question, and Evgenia, maybe this one you can take. It's, how do you assess the impact on the industry? As most tattoo artists are self-employed, the new regulations carry a high risk for the economic security of the industry.
Yes, the economic impact was assessed as part of the dossier preparation or the restriction proposal preparation, and then it was evaluated by the Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis. In principle, to determine the proportionality of the restriction, you look at a number of impacts such as economic, wider economic impacts or social impacts throughout the supply chain or on society in general. In their evaluation, in their evaluation, SEAC also took into account comments that were submitted during the public consultation, and how SEAC responded to these comments is available on our website. But I should say that it was recognized in the SEAC opinion that impacts on SMEs were considered to be the most prominent. However, based on the information available at that stage, it was concluded that closures are not expected, and as any cost increases are expected to be passed on to end consumers. For further information, I would refer you again to the background document and the opinion of SEAC in particular. Thanks.
Thank you, Evgenia. Now I'm going to go to the next question, which is a little long, so bear with me, but Mark, this one is for you. So was the standard of evidence for derogating pigments blue 15 and green 7 effectively higher than it would have been to restrict them if they hadn't been in Annex 2? In other words, did ECHA's regulatory process artificially create a higher threshold for necessary data about their safety profiles?
Thanks, Simone, for the question. I think first we should understand that these pigments were on Annex 2 of the Cosmetics regulation for a reason. And this was because a group of pigments had been suspected of causing bladder cancer in hairdressers. And so this was the reason that they were included in this annex. And then when ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee looked at the substances and the evidence that has been submitted, they felt that this initial concern about the bladder cancer had not been addressed in the responses, and the information given had not reduced their concern that the substances actually had a potential hazard for cancer. So that's why they kept them in. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Next question. Besides the current regulation, are you working on positive lists for pigments that do not pose a risk to human health in tattoo inks? Anna, could you take this one?
Yes. Yes. Well, on this, we can refer to the setting of this restriction when it was decided to choose REACH as regulatory action to regulate tattoo inks. The option of having a positive list was discarded because REACH works as a restriction of negative, not a positive list. So there is no such thing of positive list under REACH regulatory framework. So that's why there is currently no positive list under REACH. And for the moment, this is how the restriction is written, is prescribed. So for the moment, there is no work on this positive list. We are aware that there are some positive lists, for example, on preservatives and in other countries that can be useful and reference. But for the moment, we are working on the basis on our restriction. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next question is, why was the transition period of 3 years for the pigments blue 15.3 and green 7 not recognised as proposed by the RAC, but reduced to a minimum of 2 years? REACH gives much longer transition periods in other industries. Christian, could you take this one?
Thanks a lot, Simone. Well, first, a minor correction. RAC did actually propose no transition period at all, and it was SEAC, the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, that proposed 3 years as a transition period for those two pigments. As a matter of fact, then the 2 years were a result of the discussions with the member states' competent authorities in the REACH committee. So this was somewhat a compromise between the more stringent RAC position and the more, let's say, lenient, so to say, under quotation marks, position of SEAC. And most member states' competent authorities, so the majority in the REACH committee, regarded the 2 years as sufficient transition period that could be put forward for those two pigments. So just to explain how this was done. And it's true, obviously, in other restrictions, we have longer transition periods for certain substances, but each restriction must obviously be assessed case by case. And in that restriction, we had the scientific basis from the two committees of ECHA, and this was the result of the assessment done and of the discussions in the REACH committee.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Next question is, I think, for you again, Anna. What is the solution if there are no alternatives for the two very essential pigments by the beginning of 2023, because of the demand for coloured tattoos will not decrease?
Well, that's, I think we have addressed the points, the alternatives, availability of alternatives in the previous presentations that Eugenia has done. And there is, I mean, the deadline is there. So there are some ongoing studies and work on finding alternatives, but there is little thing we can do to move the deadline of January 2023. So to promote, I mean, to try to find alternatives as soon as possible. We are aware that some manufacturers, they say in their websites that they have alternatives and they are using these alternatives. So we have indications that there are some manufacturers which are able to produce compliant inks. So we hope that this can be spread over. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next question, the user is saying, as a brand and manufacturer, I've been exposed to varying versions of the truth. Where can I get support to ensure the pigments I'm buying are officially compliant and the end products also? Evgenia, maybe you could take that one.
Yeah, I think I partially answered this question earlier. You can obtain information from your suppliers on the constituents of the ingredients that you use, and if that supplier does not provide this information, you can refer to a different supplier or test the mixture to ensure compliance. Test the ingredient to ensure compliance.
Thanks, Evgenia.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's keep going. Next one says, why such strict restrictions? I.e. formaldehyde only 0.5 ppm, but over 10 ppm allowed in food. Wouldn't it be more beneficial to artists and consumers alike to have these labelled as adult products with warnings similar to the tobacco products? Maybe Anna, you could take this one as well.
Yes, thank you. I think the main objective of this restriction is to ensure a high consumer protection. And it is important to highlight again that in this case, the substances are injected into the human body for permanent and prolonged contact for life. So that's why it's so protective. We understand that there are higher limits, for example, in food. Also, formaldehyde, remind that it's a natural occurring substance. It's even in the earth from your breath. But in this case, we are talking about injecting a substance into the human body. And that's why the approach is very, very protective. And you refer to labeling for adults only, but this is not, again, you're injecting the substance, so it shouldn't be a choice for the person to get an injection with a carcinogenic substance. So even if you label, this will be in your body forever. So I know there is this debate about carcinogenic substances in tobacco, and they are not banned, but well, that's, I mean, the answer. We know there are some paradoxes on that, but we want to ensure that when you get a tattoo, you don't get carcinogenic substance in your skin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next up on the list, I'm just continuing with the order according to the like, so let's keep going. Why are tattoos treated like a cosmetic product? What justifies the dynamic link to the cosmetic product regulation? Christian?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, just to clarify, we do not treat tattoo inks like cosmetic products. We have regulated them under REACH now. So if they were treated like cosmetic products, they would be regulated under the cosmetic product regulation. No, we have on purpose, we are regulating them now under REACH. But what is true is that we have adopted a so-called dynamic link to both the cosmetic product regulation and to the CLP regulation. And that was proposed and figured out in the scientific assessment process, particular risk assessment process, and in the preparation of the restriction already, that this is the best way to ensure that the inks always reflect the latest health-related hazard information and the latest sort of state of play when it comes to serious health hazards, and so that they are quickly, so that our regulation, our restriction reacts quickly to those health hazards coming up in CLP and the cosmetic product regulation. So the cosmetic product regulation is regarded as, so to say, scientific evidence for the latest health-related hazards when it comes to substances coming in contact with the human body. And this was taken as a kind of proxy for what could also be relevant for the for our REACH restriction on tattoo inks, where substances are in addition not only put on the skin but actually injected into the skin. So that is the mechanism, and that's and also the process why this was taken up. So it's to react quickly to upcoming health related issues.
And maybe, Christian, I can keep going with you because we have a question that is questioning to you directly, obviously linking and following up on something that you've already answered. So it says, how can the artist have a certainty for the use of compliant inks when the manufacturers are stating compliance, but the artist himself is not a chemist and cannot actually recognize the correctness of the statement? Handling in EU countries is obviously not the same. Can you come back on that one?
Yes, well, I try my best to give an answer to this one. Obviously, all the actors in the supply chain have their responsibilities and their liabilities. If a manufacturer states that this is a compliant ink, compliant with the REACH regulation, to a certain extent, the downstream user has also to rely on it. And then it's also in cooperation. If there are doubts, obviously, from the downstream user side, from the tattoo artist side, you should get in contact with the authorities, because then it's also the responsibility of the authorities to enforce that regulation and to enforce all those provisions. And but I mean, every actor in the supply chain has to take up his or her responsibilities. And obviously, if there are serious doubts about the compliance of a tattoo ink that you want to use, you should get in contact also with the authorities. You should also question, obviously, the manufacturer's information. But to a certain extent, you will also need to rely on what manufacturers tell you. This is probably easier when the producers are inside the EU than when it's some imported product where the origin sometimes or the information is not complete in some cases. But yeah, this I mean, you should act obviously. Would say in a responsible manner and get in touch with the other actors if there are doubts, and also with the authorities.
Yeah, may I also jump in here to support what Christian has said? This is correct, everything you said. Normally in ECHA, we recommend that you first go back to your supplier and talk to them and confirm if you have any suspicions. And then you can inform the authorities, and you've then done your duties as a downstream user. And then if the manufacturer has done something not legal in what they are saying, then the fault is on their side. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both for a very good answer. Next up is, Mark, maybe you could take this one. Why isopropanol is restricted to 0.01 percentage weight, maximum in tattoo inks, when we all disinfect our hands several times a day with the pure substance? What's the health risk?
Thanks, Simone. I think my colleague Anna already answered this type of question before. I mean, the difference is that we're injecting this substance under the skin in terms of tattoo inks, and the skin has a natural barrier to prevent absorption of many of these substances. So what we're actually doing is bypassing that in tattooing and injecting it under the skin. So whatever hazard the substance has, we're directly affecting the body to that substance. And I think the hazards of isopropanol are a few, but at least if I remember right, it's irritating and also has other effects. So that's what we are protecting the consumers against.
Thanks, Mark. Next question, maybe Evgenia, this one can go to you. How will it be prevented that tattoo artists obtain colours illegally or outside the EU and continue to use them because there are no alternatives yet?
Yes, we covered partly in our presentation that now the Forum for Exchange of Information on Enforcement is encouraging collaboration between member states with respect to the enforcement of the restriction and with respect to the analytical methods. Certainly, member states that have already experience with implementing their national legislation can share these experiences with other member states. But indeed, the restriction places the responsibility also on the tattoo artist, as it states here in the restriction that mixture containing any of the substances shall not be used for tattoo purposes. So mixtures that do not meet the concentration requirements stated for the substances or the labeling requirements. And some of these labeling requirements include mixture for use in tattoo or permanent makeup. So it is an obligation to downstream users to follow the requirements of the restriction.
Thanks, Evgenia. And while your mic is open, maybe you could take the next one as well. It says, what exactly is the health risk? Does the pigments cause cancer?
Okay, I will refer to the RAC opinion. RAC, and I was expecting that perhaps such a question will come up. RAC found that there is enough evidence to demonstrate risk of local effects such as allergic and non-allergic, non-infectious inflammatory reactions. Evidence for systemic or malignant effects is much less clear, but RAC concluded that the risk from CMRs and other systemic effects cannot be excluded. This takes into account the intrinsic properties of these categories of substances and also the information available on toxicokinetics from human and animals that indicate that a small percentage of ink remains, only a small percentage remains at the tattoo site, while the rest is systemically available, or potentially systemically available over several days to several decades. For further information, again, I'll refer you to the RAC opinion and the background document.
Thank you, Evgenia. Anna, there's the next question refers to something that you said previously. So to my knowledge, there is no evidence of certain substances like formaldehyde to stay in the body forever after tattooing, as Mrs. Blas Rico just stated. Could studies about bioavailability or accumulation of tattoo ink ingredients lead to a change in restriction then?
Well, thank you for the question, and this allows me to clarify what I said before. Indeed, the restriction cover thousands of substances, as you know, and they have different hazards and different bioavailability in the body and everything else. So we are talking about many substances, and of course there are different characteristics of each substance. So in first place, the restriction covers all kind of hazards, and it doesn't make a distinction between immediate, for example, irritant. So irritant is immediate action, but there are others which have long-term effects, like carcinogenic substances. So to specify what I said before, indeed, the tattoo inks, what it's demonstrated as that the substance, some of them remains in the place of injection, but others they migrate through the body and they can accumulate in other organs, and they can be broken down and disappear. As you said, that's correct. Some of the substance don't stay in the same place, others they break down even in a substance which are maybe more hazardous. So okay, it's true that not all the substance remain, but the scope of the restriction is to cover all kind of hazards, from immediate hazard to long-term effects. Whether this could be there are studies about sorry, I cannot say this word today, availability in the body, or yes, well, any study or any toxicological data that could be bring forward could lead to an amendment of the restriction, as we explained before, under certain conditions. But please have in mind that it is impossible to do different limits or times for specific hazards, because that would become very, very complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next question is, there seems to be panic and general lack of understanding regarding the regulation changes for artists. Where can we access user-friendly information to artists and consumers alike? Who would like to take this one? Any takers? Evgenia, will you come in?
Perhaps I will start with that. So of course the restriction contains comprehensive labeling requirements. So the first point for information point is the label for the tattoo ink. It contains first the phrase that signifies that the ink is suitable for injecting under the skin. So mixture is for use for tattoo inks and permanent makeup. And second, it should contain a list of all the ingredients of the ink. So the suppliers, to place this label, they should have ensured that their inks in fact meet the requirements of the restriction. But it is also possible for everyone to enter the list of ingredients on our website if they are referring to chemical names. That information about those chemicals can be accessed from our website. You can see what their whether they have a harmonized classification or not. So that's one possibility to help tattoo artists and consumers. I'm sure my colleagues will have also other suggestions.
I guess we can also follow up on this question after the event in the written Q&A, and we can give some more user-friendly information on how to get this type of information. Okay, so let's then keep going. Does the restriction also apply to tattoo ink thinners, Evgenia?
Any substance that falls within the categories of the substances that we have described in the scope. So any substance that has harmonized classification as CMR, irritant, corrosive, skin sensitizer, is on Annex II of the CPR, or it has a restriction condition for use under Annex IV of the CPR, as well as any substance that is included on Appendix 13 to this restriction. So it doesn't matter what the function of the substance is in the tattoo ink.
And again, Evgenia, maybe you could leave your mic open because there's another question related to analytical methods. So what's the expected timeline for publication of analytical methods for tattoo inks? Sorry, I'll just read the full question. When do you expect that official analytical methods for tattoo inks will be published? Okay, so the same question in a slightly different way.
So before this webinar, I checked again the website of Forum, where the minutes of their meeting in March were published. Unfortunately, they were not published. So at this stage, I cannot give you more information, but I will on when this will happen. I can only repeat what I said in my presentation, that Forum is looking into first gathering information on analytical methods that will be used, with the aim of updating the compendium of analytical methods for restrictions. As I mentioned, this is a long process, and there are several needs for restrictions to do the same type of activity. For timelines, I would refer you again to our website, and then they set their own program, and they will publish when what their specific program is for the next few years, and when the compendium will be updated. Thanks.
Thank you, Evgenia. And as you can see, we have Eric joining us now. He's joining the panel, and he will be able to reply on any questions related to the biocidal products regulation. So welcome, Eric. And I will put you to work straight away with one question. Did I understand correctly that tattoo inks that contain preservatives, biocides in PT6, are considered as treated articles according to the biocidal products regulation?
Yes, that is correct, Simone. Indeed, a tattoo ink which is preserved with a preservatives in product type 6 is considered to be a treated article under the biocidal products regulation. And as said in my presentation, that means that there can be certain obligations for the tattoo ink, and that depends on the conditions which are in the approval regulation. And as also mentioned in my presentation, we will make that information available to the after this webinar. So for which biocidal products containing a certain active substance, there are these conditions for treated articles.
Thank you, Eric. And as we said, any additional question? I see another one for Eric. We would need guidance on the relevance of biocidal products regulation. Which in-can preservatives can be used for tattoo inks in relation to safety and legal compliance? How can ECHA support us in this?
Yeah, I touched upon this already in my presentation, Simone. So as mentioned, there are two situations. So first of all, the active substance can be already approved under the regulation, and then we talk about 11 active substances. And for these active substances, there is the need to have an authorization for a biocidal product. And as said, we will look into the information we get from member states to see which of these biocidal products can be used to preserve tattoo inks. So that's for the substances which are already approved. And then the other situation we have is that we have 37 active substances which are still under assessment, and their national rules will apply, and they differ from member state to member state. And also over there, we are informing member states to make those national rules available to us and to inform us whether there are preservatives which can be used for their market. So again, we're looking into it. We don't have the information at hand now, but we hope soon after the webinar that we can make this information available to the audience.
Thank you very much, Eric. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the questions we received in advance. We'll go back to that list. We have a few there that I'd like to cover before the end of the session. So the next one is, why is the concentration limit of methanol 11%? Yevgenia, can you answer this one?
Specific concentration limits were derived for substances with predominantly threshold health hazards, for which a health risk can be evaluated in a quantitative manner, and for which were not captured in the group assessment. An example of these are substances with harmonized classification for STOT-AC or methanol. In fact, methanol was the only STOT-AC substance for which specific concentration limit was derived. So a DNL, a derived no effect level, was derived and compared to the exposure assessment based on a realistic worst case scenario, and a concentration limit of 11% weight by weight was derived to ensure a risk characterization ratio is below 1. And again, this is explained in great detail in the RAC opinion and the background document.
Thank you, Eugenia. Next one, Faisal, maybe I'll give this one to you. Is it correct and necessary to mention restriction 75 in each and every SDS, which such a component down to concentration of 0.1%? If so, why only harmonized classified substances and not self-classified ones too?
Thank you for that, Simone. Right, the simple answer is yes. If there isn't a safety data sheet and it covers a restricted substance or a mixture that contains a restricted substance, then the restriction has to be mentioned in section 15.1. And for a mixture safety data sheet, if a substance is indicated in the section 3.2 for any reason, then that means that this mixture safety data sheet covers that substance, and therefore the restriction has to be mentioned in section 15.1. There was a part of the question that was referring to a pH regulator and some concentrations, but I believe that that part of the question is referring to restriction conditions related to labeling, and that becomes a label element in the safety data sheet section 2.2. but it does not affect this issue of mentioning a restriction in section 15.1. And then for the last part on harmonized classified substances, that's actually a question about the scope of the restriction itself. The restriction starts with the points A to D, where A refers to harmonized classified substances, and B, C, and D are some lists, and the self-classified substances are therefore not within the scope of the restriction.
Thank you very much, Faisal. And the next question is, does ECHA have an overview which inks are covered by registration dossiers if the uses for tattooing are covered? Evgenia, can you take that one?
Yes, we consulted with our registration colleagues, and based on a quick scan of section 3.5 of the registration dossiers, use and exposure information of the latest active and successful registrations, no substances contain the word tattoo in their registered use names under REACH. Based on a quick scan of section 3.6, uses advised against, we found 135 REACH registered substances that contain the keyword tattoo in their uses advised against. So this information can be accessed via ECHA's homepage by entering substance name, EC or CAS number, and in the search our data dialog box. Any publicly available information, including on the suppliers, is summarized under the REACH registered substance fact sheet. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the clock. I think we have about 3 minutes left for questions, so I'll go back to today's Slido and see what is the next question. Highest one on the list is, you're saying it's to protect consumers, but practically every customer I have to decline these years because they wanted colours have tried to convince me to use the old colours anyway. I'm pretty sure they just want people to use illegal colours anyway. So whose damage or protection is this really? Anna, could you come in on this one?
Yes, thank you very much for sharing this information on your experience. Well, what we can say to this is that it's very important, all these communication and information campaigns that, for example, ECHA is doing, and also some member states. We are aware that some member states are doing these campaigns to inform consumers about the risks of going to the black market or going to a tattoo artist which don't respect the requirements of the legislation. So it's very important to inform consumers that they take decisions based on safety and not only on fashion, on colors. So I just can only highlight the importance of informed consumers that don't take risk. And this will help the good actors of the sector. I can just only encourage you to continue like this and respecting the rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next question is about testing. How can we assure testing is accurate when the limits are so tight that testing and margin of error can sway one way or the other? This could essentially place products on the market that are failing. Sorry, something happened with my screen.
Perhaps I can take this question, Simone.
Please. Thanks.
So the continuation of the question is, place products on the market that are failing but show a passing result. This does not protect the consumer. What I can say again, repeat what I said in the presentation, is that Forum is encouraging an exchange of information on analytical methods used by member states, that analytical methods for many of the substances in the scope of the restriction existed because they were applied under national regulation. So even at the time of the restriction proposal, such methods weren't used. Indeed, there are some differences in how the concentration limit of how the concentration of some of the substances are measured under different methods, and Forum, whose role is to ensure consistent compliance of EU regulation, not to encourage a consistent compliance of EU regulation in the EU, is going to look into identifying analytical methods that are appropriate with the view to recommend them in their compendium for analytical methods on restrictions. Thank you.
Thanks, Evgenia. And I'm afraid we've come to the end of the question and answer session. Thank you very much to everyone. Before we end, I'll hand over to Anna for a few closing words.
Well, in the name of the Commission, I really would like to thank you all the participants for your active participation. Very, very interesting questions, and sorry we couldn't reply to everything, but we really will read through all the questions and the comments we have received. So thank you very much, and for the efforts to implement this regulation. We hope that we have all answers, but we will try then in the questions and answers, as we said. And also big thanks to ECHA for organizing this webinar to this very high standard, and in particular, big thanks to all colleagues who have worked very heavily in the preparation of this webinar. So we really appreciate the help provided and the good cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And indeed, thanks to everyone, also from our side here in ECHA. Thank you for all of your questions. As Anna said, sorry we couldn't get through each and every one of them. There was very many. We hope we got through the ones that interested you most. But don't worry, we will come back on all of the questions in the Q&A document, which will be distributed after this event. So your question will certainly be answered there, if not answered today. So it's just left for me to say thank you very much for your active participation and interest in this topic, and all the best. Bye-bye.